Our scripture reading today, can you hear me okay? Okay, is from Joshua. And I will confess that at one point this week in exasperation, I asked Jay, why are we doing Joshua again? And he reminded me, the land between. That these are stories of God and God's people in a time of great transition, where they had left behind the wilderness, which had changed them, and they're moving into the promised land, to a place they've never been before, in a situation in which they don't know where to go. So we are continuing with Joshua. Joshua chapter 8. It's long, so hang in there. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you and go up and attack Ai. For I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the city." So Joshua and the whole army moved out to attack Ai. He chose 30,000 of his best fighting men and sent them out at night with these orders. "Listen carefully. You are to set an ambush behind the city. Don't go very far from it. All of you be on the alert. I and all those with me will advance on the city, and when the men come out against us, as they did before, we will flee from them. They will pursue us until we've lured them away from the city, for they will say, 'They're running away from us as they did before.' So when we flee from them, you are to rise up from ambush and take the city. The Lord your God will give it into your hand. When you have taken the city, set it on fire. Do what the Lord has commanded. See to it, you have my orders." Then Joshua sent them off, and they went to the place of ambush and lay in wait between Bethel and Ai to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent that night with the people. Early the next morning, Joshua mustered his army, and he and the leaders of Israel marched before them to Ai. The entire force that was with him marched up and approached the city and arrived in front of it. They set up camp north of Ai with the valley between them and the city. Joshua had taken about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai to the west of the city. So the soldiers took up their positions, with the main camp to the north of the city and the ambush to the west of it. That night, Joshua went into the valley. When the king of Ai saw this, he and all of the men of the city hurried out early in the morning to meet Israel in battle at a certain place overlooking the Arabah. But he didn't know that an ambush had been set against him behind the city. Joshua and all Israel let themselves be driven back before them, and they fled toward the wilderness. All the men of Ai were called to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were lured away from the city. Not a man remained in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. They left the city open and went in pursuit of Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Hold out toward Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city." So Joshua held out toward the city the javelin that was in his hand. As soon as he did this, the men in the ambush rose quickly from their position and rushed forward. They entered the city and captured it and quickly set it on fire. The men of Ai looked back and saw the smoke of the city rising up into the sky, but they had no chance to escape in any direction. The Israelites who had been fleeing toward the wilderness had turned back against their pursuers. For when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city and that smoke was going up from it, they turned around and attacked the men of Ai. Those in the ambush also came out of the city against them, so that they were caught in the middle with Israelites on both sides. Israel cut them down, leaving them neither survivors nor fugitives. But they took the king of Ai alive and brought him to Joshua. When Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back the hand that held out his javelin until he had destroyed all who lived in Ai. But Israel did carry off for themselves the livestock and plunder of this city, as the Lord had instructed Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a permanent heap of ruins, a desolate place to this day. He impaled the body of the king of Ai on a pole and left it there until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them to take the body from the pole and throw it down at the entrance of the city gate. And there they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains to this day. Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. On it they offered to the Lord burnt offerings and sacrificed fellowship offerings. There, in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on stones a copy of the law of Moses. All the Israelites, with their elders, officials, and judges, were standing on both sides of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Both the foreigners living among them and the native-born were there. Half of the people stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had formerly commanded when he gave instructions to bless the people of Israel. Afterward, Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, just as it is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the foreigners who lived among them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Something happened on one of our first Sundays back after sabbatical that's been in my heart since then. And it's especially been with me as I've sat with this week's chapter from Joshua. It was a bit before the service was going to start. I was bringing a glass of water to the pulpit. The musicians were warming up. There were a few people in the pews and some in the back. And suddenly, those double doors burst open, and Boaz came running through, full of excitement and energy, and it was beautiful. And then, a few steps into the sanctuary, he fell. He tripped and he went all the way down. And as I remember it, I can almost feel it in my body, that jolt of hitting the hard ground. Before I could get to him to see if he was okay, he was up on his feet again, and less than a minute later, he was in the back, in Ken's arms, held and comforted. A lot of my sabbatical reentry experiences have felt like what I saw that morning. Running into church life and the busyness of the school year and being knocked flat by my own limitations, by circumstances out of my control, by my own mistakes. I feel like I've been falling a lot. And with each fall comes the invitation to get back up, to begin again, and to remember that God is with me in what is, and to trust that Jesus' loving arms are holding all of us. I hear in today's reading God inviting the people to get back up, and God reminding the people of God's presence with them wherever they are. As you may remember from 2 weeks ago when Jay preached from chapter 7, God's people have blown it. Achan took what he wasn't supposed to take, and the effects of his actions were deadly. People were killed in a battle against Ai that they thought they could win easily. Achan and his family were stoned to death. The people have seen the terrible power of God's judgment. And they have to have been wondering, we really messed up. What's going to happen now? And chapter 8 begins with God speaking to Joshua and saying again the words that God spoke to Joshua in chapter 1 that we've been saying week after week. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. God knows these people. God knows how often they sin, how often they do what they are told not to do. The whole story of the wilderness wanderings is the story of the people sinning in the same ways over and over and over again, and God continuing to love them, continuing to be with them, continuing to guide them. God knows these people. And God invites them to begin again. One commentator noted that the expression, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, anticipates military conflict. I hear in this a reminder that God knows when there's trouble ahead, and we are not to be afraid or discouraged in the face of trouble or conflict or even our own sinfulness. Do not be afraid is one of the central and repeated messages of the Bible. God tells Joshua, do not be afraid or discouraged, and then most of the chapter, as we just heard, is a somewhat detailed description of the battle for and destruction of Ai. As Jay pointed out a couple weeks ago with his maps, Ai is up a ridge from Jericho, and there are various geographical references in the chapter. People being in the north of the city, or the west of the city, or the valley, or the wilderness. It can be a bit confusing to follow who is when, where. Basically, the people of Ai think they are going to defeat Joshua as easily the second time as they did the first, and instead are ambushed and destroyed. Joshua, in echoes of earlier stories of Moses holding out his staff or holding up his arms, holds out his javelin till the battle is over. And there are plenty of gruesome details about fire and about the death of Ai's king that are deeply troubling. As Jay said before, there's a lot to wrestle with in Joshua, and a lot that has been used from Joshua to justify terrible things. It can be hard to hold together the God we know in Jesus with the God who seems so destructive in this book. I do not have answers for that. And yet, there was one phrase in the middle of the description of the ambush that caught my attention every time I read through the passage these last few weeks. It's in verse 9, before the battle. Joshua spent that night with the people. The narrator will go on to talk about Joshua spending the next night in the valley, but tells us there, Joshua spent that night with the people. I don't know why Joshua did that. Maybe it was strategic, but it seems very Jesus-y to me. God with us in our troubles, in the mess, when we are dreading what might happen. And it also reminds me of Psalm 121, which sings about how God doesn't slumber or sleep, but watches over us with love. The chapter begins with God telling Joshua, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, with God inviting the people to begin again. And the chapter ends in a place full of echoes of other beginnings. Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim and the space between. The narrator tells us that Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal and offered sacrifices there, and also wrote on stones a copy of the law of Moses. And then the narrator describes all of the people, the foreigners living among them and the native born. It's kind of an interesting phrase. All gathered there, standing on both sides of the Ark of the Covenant, half in front of Mount Ebal, half in front of Mount Gerizim. While they're standing there, Joshua read to all of the people, again with a special mention of the foreigners there, all of the blessings and curses, all of the words of the law, the words they were meant to live by. Now, there's enough in that for several different sermons, but just a few things to note today. That space between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where Joshua gathers all the people, is Shechem, the place where God first promised Abram to give the land to his descendants, and where Abram built his first altar. It's a place with memory of beginnings and God's promises. Shechem is also associated with Jacob, and in the New Testament, it's where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well and invites her to begin again. The place where the good news begins to be preached to the Samaritans. Shechem is in the modern city of Nablus on the West Bank in Palestinian territory, and it was one of my favorite places we got to visit during our time in Israel. I'm going to try the clicker. Nope, wrong way. Here we go. So this is our group standing in Shechem. That's Mount Ebal right there, Mount Gerizim. It's all very close together. Not only is there an archaeological site there with stones that are like the stones on which Joshua would have written the words of the law, but there's also this gorgeous Orthodox church there, built over a well, honoring the memory of Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman. That beautiful church was under construction during the time of the Second Intifada, a time of severe hardship for the folks living in Nablus. And it's not only a witness to the story of Jesus talking with the woman at the well, but it's an incredible testimony to God with us, inviting us to new life even when everything all around is falling apart. Just as Joshua spoke words of blessing as the people gathered in a place of beginning again, I'd like to close with some words of blessing I've shared before. I first heard them last winter at the worship symposium from Kate Williams, and they've been sitting on my desk for me to see ever since. I'll read them as our closing prayer. Blessed are those who are ready for change. Blessed are those with their eyes squeezed shut, hoping it hasn't started yet, waiting for it to pass. Blessed are those with the freedom to embrace it as it happens. Blessed are the colors and smells and crinkling sounds that remind us that time is still passing. Blessed are those who are fading. Blessed is the welcome coolness of a world on fire. Blessed is the sacred cycle that teaches us rhythm and balance of letting go and making room. Blessed are those who dare to believe that their days will brighten again someday. Excuse me. Blessed are those who do not know what will be next. Blessed is the wisdom that teaches us to quiet, to listen, to allow the dark days to do their work of renewal. Blessed are those who are falling, who are weeping, who are waiting on bated breath, who are fearing to find that fragile hope once more. Blessed is the God who catches all who fall, who is weeping with us, waiting with us, fearing with us, hoping with us, always with us. Blessed are those who bear witness to the love story of rising again over and over. Amen. As body and spirit allow, please stand and we'll sing together How Firm a Foundation.